So hi everybody, this is Falcon Napier. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. Today we're starting a new topic. We're kind of calling it breathing for change. We're going to be talking about several different aspects of breathing and how it might become very interesting and useful to us in the work that we're doing on our own personal growth and development and as we're working with our clients. But I want to lay out a few goals that I have in mind for this series. And then I want to also give kind of like a cardinal rule for our discussions. So I'll start with the goals. So goal number one, we're trying to figure out, can breathing patterns be used to identify or confirm specific placement somewhere on the change grid? So as we look at the different regions on the change grid, can we say, you know, here's some characteristics of people's breathing that will hold very true in this area. So if we notice these particular breathing behaviors, we know this is a general area where they might be on the change grid. So can we use it to identify or confirm where they're at? The second goal is, can we use those breathing patterns then to move somebody? So if they happen to be too far down grid or in grid or up grid and they want to be out grid, does the act of duplicating the out grid breathing patterns move them there? So to what degree can we use breathing as a physical change grid maneuver? And then the third one, I think, is probably going to be the one that's most interesting as far as our discussion goes, and that's, can we identify and correct breathing patterns that are not particularly useful or appropriate for the individual in that situation? And just so people understand where I'm going with this one, I'll share a personal one with you. A great deal of study has been done about the way that professional speakers and presenters breathe. And there is some very strong patterns in, I don't know how to describe them, counterproductive ways of breathing that end up, because they get practiced over and over and over again, they become part of the pattern of the way that people speak. And for me, because I speak very, very quickly when I'm in front of an audience, I'm very animated. I've got very long programs. I didn't do half-hour programs. I did, well, multi-days, but I would be talking almost nonstop for 6, 7 hours on a given day. I didn't breathe very well. I never took deep breaths. Everything was very upper chest, shallow, fast breathing, and it often sounded, if I was recorded, like I was gasping for air, and I didn't know that that was something I was doing. I was just trying to deliver a good training program. Well, lo and behold, now that we're research, and see, I'm just doing it now. I have to stop and swallow. I'm constantly trying to, now that I'm aware of it, I'm irritating myself, quite honestly. um, but I just think it was interesting as I was reading, it says, oh no, that's one of the very known patterns that I'm going to call it dysfunctional, but non-ideal patterns that presenters seem to develop breathing-wise. And because they get so used to it, they continue to breathe that way even when they're not in front of audiences. And so how can we go about helping someone to identify those kinds of less than productive or less than ideal ways of breathing and kind of re-educate their pattern to something that would be more appropriate, useful, beneficial, bottom line healthy for that particular individual? So those are the three goals. So can we identify where someone is on the grid based on some attributes of breathing? Can we move someone if we have them duplicate the attributes of a particular region? And what can we do to help someone better understand, recognize, and deal with whatever their less than ideal way of breathing happens to be? There is one little rule I want to put out there for at least the early discussions we have on the subject, and that is that I want to focus on the breathing patterns that we encounter in someone with a properly functioning human body. I don't want to throw in issues that people have of a physical nature or some sort of a medical issue that is definitely compromising whatever their breathing may be. We might talk about some of those later on down the road, but I get it completely. If someone's got asthma, if someone has COPD, if they've got, give me a whole list of different maladies, I know that's going to affect their breathing. But for our purposes, at least initially, let's assume that the individual has an otherwise normal, properly functioning body. The only thing that's changing is whatever their attitudes, beliefs, their thought processes, their emotional state. Those are the things that are changing. And as those thoughts and emotions and other things are changing, they're moving around on the change grid, and their breathing is also changing as we do that. So later on, we can talk a little bit, because I do think it's interesting to say that people who do have underlying medical issues may be, because of that medical issue, forced to be in a particular place on the change grid because that's the pattern that emerges. And for those of you who have your medical backgrounds and all that, I think that's when we'll be turning to your expertise, so we can say, look, if we're dealing with someone who has some sort of true respiratory problem, how does that move them? And are we likely to then see that set of characteristics become part of their behavior now that they're dealing with whatever that illness happens to be? Or even we could say, forget anything chronic. What about when all of us just come down with a bad cold? Do you remember when we were allowed to have colds? Now you can only have COVID, but remember when you could just have a plain old everyday cold, a regular old everyday sinus infection? Well, these are also affecting your breathing, which would in turn affect your movement on the change grid, which would then impact whatever your behavior happens to be. So I think it'll be interesting to look at what's going on when we aren't otherwise healthy. But I think we should start with the assumption is we are dealing with an individual with an otherwise normal, functioning, typical human body. Fair enough. So questions, comments about those goals or our little focus to get things started? No? Okay, silence is agreement. So I see some of you have unmuted, so go right ahead, chime in.
I'm very excited, T. Thank you so much. This is what I've been looking for a while. So
Well,
great.
wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, and we'll be getting into patterns and things like that as time goes on. So other comments before we launch into what I had in mind for today?
I love how you framed it, because I would think that if you're suffering from something acute as opposed to what has now become chronic,
Mm-hmm.
that will shift that breathing pattern.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that we'll be able to come up with lots of examples where things that were sudden, unforeseen, and unexpected that happened in our life may very well impact our breathing in that instant, I'm sure, but it may have some short-term but lasting impact, and maybe even some long-term. So it'll be very interesting to just go, well, what happens when the situation changes? But for now, let's just kind of take a look at an otherwise normal functioning, plain old, regular old human body. Okay, other questions, comments? All right, so the first thing that I want to do is say, let's draw on the knowledge we already have about tension management, about people's levels of drive, about the layers on the change grid, and see if we can make any general conclusions, draw any general conclusions about what patterns we might be seeing. So we're going to be looking at very, very gross sort of patterns, big patterns, and we'll see what kind of a map starts to arrive. And so I've put together a good, I don't know, what is that, 10 or 11 different clusters of descriptors. And I just want to kind of work our way through them and see if we can say, well, that would be here and that would be there. And I might need to duplicate them because they might happen more than one place. But that first one in the upper left corner, the idea about automatic breathing and deliberate breathing. I'll go ahead and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that automatic breathing occurs everywhere on the change grid. So Brian, Jane, you're the doctors. Am I right? We're always breathing.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
it may have a different characteristic. It may
Right.
be yawning, puffing, blowing, hyperventilating, but it'll be automatic.
Yeah, right.
Would
So
be.
we're always breathing. In fact, Brian, what did you call it? It's one of those things that we don't need to think about. We don't really have a choice in the matter. Well, so
Oh, you mean the diaphragmic breathing?
well, I'm just saying that breathing is part of how we are programmed. It's part of
It-
our basic operational system. It's
It's part of the
Yeah.
autonomic
right.
nervous system.
Yeah. So
Exactly.
I just wanted to say that no matter what we're about to say about deliberate breathing is not a replacement for automatic breathing. Deliberate breathing is something that's going to kind of supersede what would automatically be happening anyway. So,
Right.
so the question for all of you is, where on the change grid do you believe people are able to make a conscious, intentional, deliberate choice to manage their breathing pattern? Where on the grid would we bother with that?
The PowerPoint.
The center of the change grid, I would say absolutely true. But Kathy, tell me a little bit about a situation. Why might we exercise some deliberate intentionality around our breathing patterns when we're in
Well,
the center of the
the
change grid?
PowerPoint area is where we find our center, and we are in a place where we are detached and make choices from there. And so we know, I mean, so this is a chicken and egg kind of response, but we know that deliberate breathing will bring us to the PowerPoint. Doesn't have to be intense breathing or deep breathing, but just deliberate, just conscious breathing will bring us there. And it will also allow us to stay there because it tends to steady us.
Yes.
So this is a non-medical response. This is a practitioner's response.
Yeah, right. But it's also a response that is echoed by so many different forms of wellness, mindfulness, yoga, meditation. It's all about when you deliberately control your breathing, you are able to achieve a whole lot of different changes to your state.
So,
And so we get that, yes.
I have a question, or I have a comment about that. So I would substitute for deliberate, I would substitute or add the word conscious, because you, in meditation, you're conscious of your breathing without trying to control or be deliberate. You're not deliberate about how you're breathing. You're just noticing that you are breathing. And so to me, those are two really different things.
I would
Well,
think,
then,
and to that point, that deliberate, you'll be upgrade because you're trying to control a situation, or at least there's
Right.
an opportunity to try to control a situation. Because
Yeah.
like what Jane was just describing, the autonomic nervous system is hypothalamus oriented. So it's designed to do exactly what Kathy just explained, to bring you back to center. Like that's homeostasis that we're talking about at that point.
excellent. And you've also given me the word I was missing. So let me just make a little adjustment here and you'll see what I'm going on to. So I do like this idea about that in the middle, we are conscious of it. We can do deliberate things to move us to the center. But once we are at the center, we would be conscious of our breathing. But I need to still use the word deliberate because it's going to describe another location. Now, Brian, you said the deliberate breathing would be more upgrid. Tell me about why upgrid would make me more deliberate in my breathing.
If you're in that predicament, like I'm thinking from like an athletic perspective, and you're breathing hard. Like I've always had that challenge where breathing in through your nose, but then slowly out through your mouth, and you let go of required oxygen that you need. So some of the carbon is secreted that way, and so you lose that capacity. So it's always telling me how to breathe to control, even when you're in these heightened situations, when you're in an athletic endeavor.
Sure.
So I had to focus very deliberately on that because, like yourself, I'm trying to do something else that's working against me. and I don't even
Right.
realize it.
So let me just throw one element into what you've just said. You've characterized that as upgrid, and I will agree that the challenge is upgrid, but the behavior for meeting that challenge
It's
moves me
outgrid.
elsewhere. I
Yeah,
think athletic performance
outgrid.
lives outgrid.
Yeah, yeah.
And so this is where, and I put it down here a little bit. Okay, I'm a weightlifter, but I mean, technically what I do is bodybuilding, but I don't look that part, so I don't believe I have earned or re-earned that title quite yet. But the difference between what I do and a power lifter, power lifters do this thing that they refer to as puff and blow.
Mm-hmm.
So as they approach whatever weight, ridiculous amount of weight they're trying to move, but for whatever reason it brings them joy, they approach it, and they'll start really huffing and puffing, really, really, really. And then they will hold their breath to get the weight into position, and then they blow it out to do that. Well, that's a very deliberate pattern, but it's a pattern that they are using because they believe it gives them the ability to meet that challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And unless they collapse on the floor or whatever, they're right. And so that's why I'm thinking that particularly when it comes to the breathing associated with athletic performance, we're looking at something more outgrid than we
Yeah,
are upgrid. So does
yeah.
that resonate?
Yeah, it
Well,
does with me.
Yeah.
I think that deliberate could, if you're trying to move somebody on the change grid and you have them adopt a different pattern to move,
Mm-hmm.
deliberate could be anywhere on the change grid that you're trying to move. So for example, if you want to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, you take a long inhale and a
Yes.
short exhale. And if
Yes.
you want to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, kind of wake yourself up a little bit, you take a short, deep inhale and a long exhale.
Yes.
And so those would be deliberate patterns, and you could be either calming yourself down or getting yourself more, waked up or awake.
Right. And now what you've done is identified a maneuver. So we can either determine to do that ourselves, or an outsider is giving it to us as a pattern to duplicate. My point about where does deliberate live is that if I am upgrid, my breathing is not deliberate. I can adopt a deliberate breathing pattern to move myself,
Right.
but when I'm up there, my breathing is not deliberate. Similarly, if I'm very far down grid, I'm down in apathy, I'm not deliberate in my breathing. I'm just, I'm as automatic as I'm going to get. But I could choose, or someone could encourage me to duplicate any kind of a breathing pattern that would move me anywhere. And so I think we can all make breathing more deliberate, and that's where change actually is going to come from. So that's why it's like, I said we got the two goals. First of all, do the breathing patterns help us identify somewhere on the change grid where someone is, and then can we use them to move? So if I said, where on the change grid are you going to most naturally be more aware of and deliberate in your breathing behavior? That's why I was saying it's kind of more mid-grid, but I like your idea about calling that. That's more conscious, but the deliberate part is a little bit further out-grid, and it's only as far out as I'm showing right now because it's a long word. but I think that we're saying that when we've decided to do something deliberately for our let's just do it this way. If I've decided to do anything deliberately, what energy am I experiencing? You got your four choices. Edie, you can just speak. You've got, you have your
Yeah,
hand raised.
you said a little while ago. Yeah, okay, I'll wait till this stops. Mhm.
Yeah. Well, what I was saying was that the energy that is involved in anyone doing anything deliberately, would that energy be expressive, amiable, analytical, or driven?
It's driver.
There's a driver energy
Driver.
that's involved. Now, maybe they're not as far a grid as I'm showing right here, but certainly I know, going back to our athletic performance, if someone believes, like, again, an Olympic athlete is in the outgrid danger zone. but they think they can handle it, and that's what they got to do if they want to stand on that platform. So I get that. They don't want to necessarily live there, but they can rise to the occasion for their competitions. So I think this is what I'm just going like, I don't think deliberate, intentional breathing is something we're going to find upgrid or ingrid or downgrid. But it is something that happens outgrid, and it can be used because we've made that conscious choice to move anyone from anywhere to anywhere. So might I say this to you guys that are practicing any kind of meditation or whatever, how did you come to decide to even adopt that practice? Was there not some element of driver energy that came along and said, I need to, or I would like to achieve whatever, therefore I am going to do whatever? And that is actually a kind of like an outgrid choice to make a mid-grid or a PowerPoint movement.
No, that makes perfect sense to
Yeah,
me.
that makes sense.
I
Yeah.
really like what you're saying because you know, I loved it when James had said it is conscious, that is the difference, but deliberate is really what we are focusing on with this whole conversation, and it is a place of power. You know, what are we doing deliberately around breathing, around the topic, the entire topic of what we're discussing today.
Right. And by the way, that applies to both the professional and to the client. So I, as an individual, could become more deliberate in my management of my own breathing to achieve whatever outcomes I'd like to achieve. But even when you guys are in your role as coaches and consultants, you're at least slightly outgrid. I'll at least give you the say you are a slight amiable driver at the very least, to even go about suggesting that someone might want to adopt a particular behavior or move somewhere else on the change grid. There's always a driver element in the work that we're doing, but because we tend to come to our work from a place of strong heart, a place of caring, that's what that amiable energy is really all about. So, you know, an amiable driver energy is where this deliberate quality begins to live. Remember, if we really look at the adjective map, we'd say that an amiable driver isn't particularly demanding. They're not particularly coming across with a great direction or anything like that, but they very much suggest things. They encourage things. They support things. You know, those are amiable driver behaviors that are certainly something we find in any form of coaching or therapeutic sort of work. And obviously, the further outgrid we go, the less people-oriented it becomes, the more task-oriented it becomes, and now people will become very insistent, very aggressive, very dominating, domineering, directive, etc. That behavior is more of the driven driver side of things. So, okay, so I guess are we comfortable with what we've done here, just saying about where we end up being conscious of our breathing and where we become more deliberate about our breathing?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I do want to emphasize that just because I'm outgrid doesn't mean that I'm being deliberate in my breathing. It just means that the outgrid energy would support me if I wanted to be more deliberate about breathing. The vast majority of people spend the vast majority of their outgrid existence automatically breathing. They're not giving any thought to it at all.
Right. That's
Right?
what I was trying to explain, that for me, you know, I wasn't aware of it.
No.
So if I wasn't aware of it, I couldn't address it. And thankfully that it is connected to the autonomic nervous system, because for some people, you know, that I see, we're just moving, so busy, you'll forget to breathe.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and some people do. You
Yeah,
know,
they do. Right.
just like you said when you were doing those talks, and you would just talk so fast you would not be breathing.
Right. Yep.
Um,
It's absolutely true. Yep. Okay. But also I'd like to say that even mid-grid doesn't mean that we are conscious of our breathing. right? We could just be running on autopilot.
Right.
But if we'd like to practice this conscientiousness around our breathing, that's where it would live on the ChangeGrid. So I consider both conscious breathing and deliberate breathing to be a layer we put on top of automatic breathing. It's a choice we're making. It is a sort of a layer of consciousness above. Does that work for everybody? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
For
Good.
sure.
Now, one other thing, going to Brian's point about people forget to breathe. In the old days of fitness clubs, one of the first national chains was Vic Tanny's. Do you guys, any of you remember the days of Vic Tanny's?
Mhm.
Okay. And they were all over the country. Well, they were all about circuit training. So circuit training was the first thing. You do an exercise, you do a couple of laps around their track, you do another exercise. And while all this was going on, there was this nonstop recording that was tormenting every single member that constantly said, exhale upon exertion, exhale upon exertion. Oh, it was torture. It was torture, but that's part of it. You had to actually remind people, don't hold your breath when you're doing an exertion. Exhale upon exertion. And so, yeah, this is all about how we go about learning something, training people, conditioning them, and sooner or later, those patterns could become quite subconscious or unconscious, and they'll just do them. Okay, any other thoughts about conscious versus deliberate?
You know what, T, this goes before you were talking about that when you were talking about athletics. I think we have to be clear to define athletics, because I think the breathing in something more cognitive like golf is very different than, say, football or a sprinter. So I just think we have to make.
Well, how would you feel if we said that every sport taken to the level of professional performance has probably had somebody study what the ideal breathing patterns are for that? Because I'm not a golfer, but I have to believe that as someone approaches the ball, that a really good golfing coach or golfing trainer has told them that how they breathe, when they breathe matters.
Yeah.
I would say that,
Mhm.
go ahead.
No,
Sorry.
you're good. You're good. Yep.
Well, I would just say that if you're playing a really fast sport like lacrosse or soccer or something like that, you're probably not thinking of breathing because your attention is so focused
Absolutely.
on
Absolutely.
the ball. But if you're a baseball player walking up to the plate to bat, or you're a golfer or something, I think consciousness about your breathing is really, really important.
Because you have a moment to get prepared, whatever you're about to do. I would also think that even in fast sports, that hopefully they're doing some sort of breathing awareness, breathing training when they're practicing, or when they're doing that kind of the athletic kind of training. But now we'd have to go to what we were talking about with the neurotransmitters, that because we can't expect the person to focus deliberately on their breathing while they are doing whatever their sport happens to be, we'd better make sure that they have been so well trained and conditioned that that becomes an automatic thing as they're out there on the field. So while I don't know anything about soccer or anything like that, I would imagine that top-ranked soccer players are going to breathe in a particular way before they kick the ball. And maybe they practiced it and now it's become automatic for them. But I would say that if they haven't been looking at breathing, they're missing an opportunity to improve overall performance.
Yeah, we definitely practiced with that. That's what brought me to the States was soccer, or football as we call it. But then like what Jane was talking about in martial arts, because you're not moving per se as much as you are in soccer, so the breathing patterns that we were taught were more like what you were taught in bodybuilding.
Yeah.
So it's for the execution of a strike. And so I had all of these automated. So when Kathy was teaching me the breathing, that changed the whole game for me. It like really brought me down to the point, like I said, I took a nap afterwards. I was feeling a little bit too relaxed.
Yeah,
And that's what the
excellent.
physicians that I train them on it, that's what they do. So when they're in an emergency room, they're confronted with crises, their recovery strategy, as we talked about, is they go on a stairwell, they practice that breath like Kathy taught, and then they come back and they feel regenerated. And that's what breath does. It really resets the body, literally.
Mhm, mhm.
And in that training, this is where triggers come in, that you can train people to associate a certain breathing pattern with at the moment you pick up the mic or the bat. As a professional speaker, I do that. I've done that for 50 years, where when I put that mic in my hand, it automatically triggers a certain state. So we can train with triggers. I just wanted to mention
Mm-hmm.
that.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very
Absolutely.
good. Very good.
That's good.
All right, several of you have unmuted. You're all welcome to chime in, anything you might like to add. So anyone have anything else they'd like to add about what we're talking about so far? Okay, yes, go ahead.
What is the element of analytical when you're really thinking this through? Like and maybe you want to bring yourself down.
Mhm. See,
So,
and that would be an interesting question to go, what are the characteristics of breathing that occurs when someone is in an analytical energy?
right.
And I think a lot of that's going to be shown as we start to move these other words to places on the change grid. But I think that building on this idea about deliberateness, if I can identify what breathing patterns help me to become more analytical, then I can deliberately do them. But in the act of making that deliberate choice, I am no longer down grid. So this is why, just a reminder to everybody, you must never forget that the change grid is exclusively activity specific. And the activity of being analytical is different than the activity of getting myself into an analytical state. And I'll give you guys an example of this. Right now, one of the most popular types of videos or subjects for videos on YouTube is study skills. And there are a lot of people who are putting together videos that are teaching people how to be able to sit down in front of a computer, no one else around, and study nonstop for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, do it 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, and actually have it be quality study time. And so, of course, one of the things that they do talk about is how you get yourself ready to do something as analytical as studying is. And one of the things they talk about is breathing. So they also talk about distractions and lots and lots and lots of other things. Obviously, they're building channels around the subject. But I think it's just important for all of you to remember that when we say understanding something that's an analytical energy, that activity is different than doing something, that activity is different than helping someone else get around to doing it. So just always get clear about, as I'm thinking about this and as I'm answering this, what is the specific activity that I have in mind? Because if we change that activity, the location on the change grid, it will certainly change too. But let's talk a little bit about some of these other attributes just to see if we can come up with what are the characteristics of analytical breathing, or the breathing being kind of when someone's being analytical. Okay, so let me throw something out for one. Let's talk about the breathing rate. I remember long ago, I became certified as a paramedic. And I remember when they were telling us about taking vital signs, that when it comes to breathing, there were 3 things that we had to be able to answer for the medical professionals. And that was, they want to know, what's the breathing rate? What's the breathing rhythm? What's the breathing depth? And so we had to be able to say that they are breathing quickly, shallowly, but it's steady, or it's might be sporadic breathing, and it's a very fast, and it's not a very, you get the idea. Those were the 3 things. What was the rate of breathing? What was the rhythm of the breathing? What is the depth of the breathing? So let's first talk about the rate. And again, we're just looking for general locations on the change grid. And this particular one, I would define as attention-based trend. Attention-based trend is some sort of characteristic that is going to be true at one extreme, and the opposite will be true at the other extreme. So when I look at the levels of tension, so again, you guys all know the change grid, but if I throw this up right here, we got stress very far up grid, we got apathy very far down grid. Where am I likely to encounter rapid breathing, and where am I likely to encounter slow breathing? So this
Up grid for rapid
Rapid.
and down grid for slow.
exactly. Where did my chart just go? Oh, things move around. I don't understand. All right, so if I said, okay, well, upgrid, relatively speaking, things will be fast. The further upgrid I go, perhaps the faster the breathing goes. As I move down grid, the breathing rate will also become a bit slower. So I think that kind of fits everything we already know about the level of productive tension and how it affects other vital signs. I am curious to know, do you believe there's a horizontal relationship as well, or prediction as well? So again, the vertical axis is about the level of productive tension the person's experiencing. Again, quiz question for all of you. What would the horizontal axis tell me? What
Slow,
changes from in-grid to out-grid?
slow in grid, fast out grid.
Okay, yeah, and so the characteristic that's changing is the level of drive that someone has. And so if I said, well, very far out grid, I think I wouldn't be surprised to find that people are breathing rather quickly. And very far in grid, I wouldn't be at all surprised to find out that people are breathing a bit more slowly. And these are very general sorts of things, but nevertheless, we learn a lot from looking at generalities first. Okay, other questions, comments, thoughts about fast and slow? No? And so in the middle, I was going to put moderate for all these, and I felt like there's just going to end up with a pile of moderates on top of each other as if we do that. So we've got the ranges. Now, can I give you guys a gifted students question? Yeah?
Sure.
Say yeah, because it's heading your way no matter what. Okay, so just remember, upgrid and outgrid is fast, and downgrid and ingrid is slow. Well, if we look at the comprehensive adjective map and we look at the dark side of the change grid, then something very interesting happens at the powerless point. And that would be upgrid we have fast, and outgrid we have fast, and downgrid we have slow, and ingrid we have slow as well. So what that would tell me, and then I'll throw this to the medical professionals, is that when someone is in one of these super extreme situations, they are at that red powerless point. So 0, 0, 0, 12, 12, 12, 12, 0 as far as their perceptions. They end up at the same spot, but they might be breathing very, very quickly. They might be breathing very, very slowly. They might switch from being very fast breathing to very slow breathing. And that becomes the question for my medical professionals. Do patients in these life or death sorts of moments vacillate between fast breathing, slow breathing? Maybe it's one, maybe it's another. Is there kind of a paradoxical sort of breathing that one might encounter in that situation?
I would say it depends on the underlying pathology to
Yeah.
a large extent.
Okay.
Yeah, I've only seen it one time in the emergency room situation, but like Jane said, we were just simply trying to figure out what was causing this. But you know how they show, like on TV, how they show, you know, the heart rate going up, down, up, down, up, down, and that's typically not how it goes. Like when someone is close to flat line, that thing is going berserk. You know,
Right, at the very yeah, and I remember there was a very specific name for that breathing that occurs at that last moment of life, and a specific term for what's happening as far as the cardiac activity at that. It's as though the the human body wants to survive. So at the very
Right.
last moment, it's going to throw out every last bit of energy it has to try to survive. And so that means a lot of breathing all of a sudden. That means a lot of cardiac activity all of a sudden. And then we know the flat line is, heading
Right.
that way.
What about chain soaking?
Yeah, see, now we're getting into very specific different behaviors where there is some sort of an underlying medical condition. Because I was looking at abnormal breathing patterns it's interesting. You go searching for breathing patterns, you would think you could find an easy source of regular normal breathing patterns. You cannot, but you can find extensive documentation about abnormal breathing patterns. And the one you just changed, Stokes, I think is the one, that's one. But there are so many that have been named after whoever the researcher was that identified the breathing pattern. But that's why I wanted to say at the beginning, for now, let's focus on an otherwise healthy, normal functioning one. And then we can bring out, well, what's happening when they start to do this breathing pattern or that breathing pattern or whatever the case may be. Oh, someone sent me a little email as I was bringing up the subject of deliberate breathing, and they brought up childbirth. So, so going back to that for just a second, childbirth, would you guys say is more of an upgrid, outgrid, downgrid, or in-grid behavior?
Up and out.
Okay, yeah, it's outgrid with upgrid moments. So it's very deliberate, it's very conscious, and people that are helping you through there, whether it's a midwife, whether it's an obstetrician, whatever, they're going to tell you, duplicate the following breathing pattern.
Lamaze.
Yeah, Lamaze sorts of stuff, etc. Okay, so again, both that's an outgrid behavior as far as suggesting it to someone or deciding to do it. Okay, one last thing I'll tell you about this dark side of the ChangeGrid. I've often said this as a joke to my audiences, but I've always meant it. I said, generally, death occurs 2 places on the ChangeGrid. We're talking about natural sort. Very far upgrid things can kill you because you actually are physically threatened. This is where explosive sorts of things might occur, but you can also just, you know, disappear, wither away, and just kind of, you know, die that way. The joke I've always said is that when I die, I'd like to go quietly and peacefully in my sleep, not like all the passengers in my grandfather's car. So there you go. Okay, I can turn that into a better joke. I'll work on it, but I never claimed to be a stand-up comic. All right, so so I think we're pretty good when it comes to fast and slow. Now let's do another one, and that's going to be about deep or shallow. So where on the ChangeGrid are you likely to take very deep, thorough, full cleansing sorts of breaths? Where are you going to be very shallow in your breathing? Obviously, most of the area in the ChangeGrid, you're going to be somewhere in between. But where do you think shallow breathing occurs? Where do you think deep breathing occurs?
I would say shallow upgrid.
Any place else you want to put shallow? Any place you want to put deep?
Well, it could also be in-grid and
In-grid.
down-grid even.
Yeah.
So shallow could be in-grid, and shallow could be down-grid. Any place else you want to put shallow? Okay, I do. I also want to put it outgrid. Because here's my thought. When you've got someone, if we look at the outgrid danger zone and we see that the person is being very angry and very domineering and very brutal and cruel and all that, I think that's very, well, you'll learn in a moment, very upper chest kind of breathing. And if you're only breathing with your upper chest, you have no hope for any kind of a deep breath. If it's just chest breathing or intercostal breathing, there's just not an opportunity, because what do you think allows your body to fill your lungs to their maximum capacity? Is it your chest muscles? Is it your intercostal muscles? What muscle helps you to fill your lungs fully?
Diaphragm.
That's the diaphragm. And
Yeah.
so if I want to have any hope at all of a deep, deep breath, I got to get my abdomen involved. I got to get that diaphragm into action. Otherwise, my breathing is going to be more in the upper part of my chest, and just by force of the physical constrictions inside of your rib cage, your lungs don't have as much of a chance. And so I think when people are in those outgrid behaviors, that driven driver sort of behavior set, I think it's not at all surprising that they too would also be breathing shallowly, but a fast and shallow as opposed to a slow and shallow.
Yeah, good.
All right. So where then would deep breathing become sort of a expected thing?
I would think in the middle, in the
I would
center.
think, yeah, in the middle, because I would say this to you guys, while there are certain moments of breathing where we will all do something very deep, if we're talking about deep breathing as a pattern that will continue for X number of minutes, how many of you recognize that that's the whole goal of learning yoga or meditation or any of those kinds of other breathing related sorts of behaviors? It's about reminding yourself, take deep diaphragmatic sort of breaths so that you can fill your body with that fresh air and then get rid of all of it. So it's this cleansing sort of a breath to really breathe as deeply as you can. How many of you would say, I need to be a little more conscious of that? So can I be relatively deeper? Like if I said, I'll just do this. I'm going to copy and paste this over here, and I'm going to say deeper, deep-ish. No, we'll change a word, deep-ish. So I think that people that are here on the change grid might be deep-ish, because when I'm sleeping, we become abdominal breathers when we're sleeping, assuming there's nothing wrong with us. I believe that my breathing is deeper than it would be otherwise. Tell me if you think that I'm wrong, because that's my only question about here when I go, if I'm sleeping, is my breathing shallow? Is my breathing deep? Where am I when I'm relaxed?
I would hope that it's deepish.
Deepish. I'm thinking it's deepish.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
then when I'm finally asleep, maybe it becomes a bit more shallow, mostly because I'm at rest. But yeah, so deepish. And I also believe if we go here, copy and paste, deepish might be here a little bit. I don't know. Is there deepish up here? Mm, I'm not so
deepish is
sure.
upgrade. I don't think deepish is upgrade. I think it gets progressively shallow so it could be, if deepish is part of the.
So maybe if I just go like, well, deepish is probably a bit further even upgrade than that. And again, we're just having some fun today, seeing if we can just use our current level of knowledge and our instinct and our personal experience just to get some general plottings as we work our way through the series. I'd like to become increasingly specific and increasingly scientific if possible. But I like the word deepish. We should use it frequently. So it can,
So now I'm wondering if since we have all these different baselines that we, kind of train our body in, particularly around these ultradian rhythms, these natural biological rhythms. So now I'm wondering, do we have the same thing when it comes? I would assume we do with breathing, because like I said, I'm used to, and I don't even have to think about it when it comes to breathing for execution in sports, like when I'm doing martial arts, and I use the same thing when I'm working out. But like I said, the breath that Kathy taught me become like something that I practice now. Like when I feel wired up, because it brought me way down to the point where I wanted to go to sleep. And when I'm listening to like brainwave kind of CDs, the same thing happened. Like I have to make sure that I'm sitting up, because if I'm lying down, like they say, you can lie down and relax and they teach you breathing. Next thing I know, I'm wake up and it's 6 hours later. So I'm wondering, I must have a very low threshold of baseline or something for that kind of breathing that just takes me out completely.
Well, isn't that wonderful to know that, so that you can call upon it whenever it will serve you? I think that's absolutely fantastic to have that awareness. I do believe that anybody can learn how to fall asleep faster. And maybe it's the breathing is one of the most powerful elements of being able to fall asleep faster. I know we've studied different sorts of patterns for counting the number of breaths, the duration of breaths, etc. So I get it. But what I'd like to bring to everyone's attention, and I'll do it again as a quiz question: definitive change only occurs two places on the change grid. So where does change occur?
Outgrid and upgrid.
Outgrid and upgrid. So follow-up question for the gifted students. What's the difference between the changes that occur outgrid and the changes that occur upgrid?
The upgrid is less focused, and outgrid would probably be more focused.
That is absolutely correct. So tell me more about that. What other descriptors would you use?
Because when you are in stress and power, the notion is that your cognitive processes are such that they are confused, right? They're not together, and so this might happen, and you can find yourself, or maybe a bunch of alternatives that you're cycling through. But as you go further down, it seems to me like those become more in focus as you get more ability.
Ah, very good. Very good. Yep.
Then you're able to bring focus and deliberation to it.
Yes. Well, and so the way that I've kind of described in the past is to say that upgrid changes are driven by external factors.
Yes.
So something happened outside of you, and now, well, for whatever reasons, you got to change, you've got to adapt, you have to adjust, you have to accommodate. But outgrid changes are driven by internal factors, so choices that you've made, a willingness to do something, a conscious choice has occurred there. Now, as Brian was describing his situation, it may very well be that an external situation occurred that moved you upgrid, and as a result of that, you now say, I've got to make some sort of a change. But rather than just reactively do things that may or may not be useful, you at some point said, no, I'm going to make a conscious, deliberate choice here. I'm going to intentionally do something to make this change happen. So you move from being in that upgrid response for change to an outgrid response to change, and you ended up doing something that you learned how to breathe, and that helped you move more mid-grid or down-grid, or whatever the case may be. So again, I like to be able to remind you guys as often as I can that these very basic things you learned in ChangeGrid about the nature of change and your core training in the grid itself, it's just going to continue to get proven again and again and again, whether we are looking at breathing or neurotransmitters or whatever we happen to be chatting about. So our goal is to always say, where does this fit on the change grid? How does this merge into the brilliance that we've already assembled all together from so many
And T, if you think about maneuvers, some of those are really directing people to internal processes.
Well, I would like to think that in our work as coaches particularly, we really are doing our best to help move people
You might be
from an
asking
external to an internal locus of control.
That would seem to be, at least, I don't know so much about provide resources, but restore resources is really asking people to go inside themselves and identify that. Or even the normalizing is helping them internally reflect or give them something that says, this is normal now if you get to this place. So you're focusing them on that. And there are things that can be done about it. Or if you simplify it, then you're also changing their focus.
Exactly. And hopefully moving them more into the outgrid place for change. I'll give you an example of this. A couple of you on the call right now work with populations that may or may not be sitting down with you willingly. And so sometimes we have court-ordered clients that we're working with. Sometimes people come to us of their own volition. So you can imagine if you've got someone who is working with you, getting coaching against their actual will, they may go through the motions because they have this upgrade situation going on. They have really no choice but to comply if they want to achieve whatever their freedom or flexibility happens to be. But in your role as being that provider of services, I am sure that your thought is, if they just go through the motions, no real lasting change is ever going to occur. I have to do whatever I can do to get them to take this from a situation that's been imposed upon them to viewing it as an opportunity for them to really get some new control in their life that will serve them well, as they move on, and hopefully mean they won't be a repeat sort of a situation. That's moving someone from responding to that external stimulus for change into going like, well, that might have gotten the ball rolling, but really real, true, long-lasting change occurs out-grid. And so again, that's why I see this whole word deliberate. While we applied it to breathing, it's still, this is a place where deliberate behavior occurs. And by the way, one little last thing, I know we're coming to the top of the hour, but if I look at the engagement rings, where'd they go? Here they are. So if I go to the engagement rings, we're talking about outgrade. This is where someone, moves from being aware to making an intention to getting engaged and getting things done. So this is where that kind of stuff is actually going to change in a longer, more beneficial sort of way.
I think what's interesting for me for what you're just describing is when people are in those kinds of programs, often they're taught what to do, not how to be. And so, like Kathy and Jane, they talk about this power, the somatic. People don't understand. I always say being is the first call to action often, because I worked with, and back in the state of Florida, I'm a advocate for the court.
Yes.
For foster care kids. And so I was a foster parent for 13 years, and you take them to I take them to anger management classes, and they teach them how to count to 3 and calm down. I'm like, you're not teaching them anything about what I'm seeing physically, how their body is. So, I mean, if you don't teach them how to be, then anything you teach them to do is going to be quite temporary.
Oh, I agree with that so much, Brian, because that really gets into the identity again. Because when you begin to tell someone, are you a helpless victim of your circumstance, and in what ways are you not a victim, but are you something else, you're making an identity shift. And then from that perspective, some of these other behaviors become even normal when they think about it, and not something that has to be deliberately learned. You just come to a different level of consciousness. You see different things to do.
And then you can experience that in your body uniquely differently. So everything becomes like this integrated process.
Yes, that's the point you always make about integration. So if you have that mental integration about who you are at that point, then these other things do become techniques. I'm doing this thing on the language of the trusted advisor, but I won't take people in who want to use the techniques manipulatively. And so the first part I'm going to have on that is what is the identity of a trusted advisor? If you're going to then learn these kinds of skills, and it isn't just to get clients and manipulate them as a way to come, but what is that identity that you have to be rooted in for this really to have efficacy?
Right.
I love this. I love that it's all coming together. Well, we're at the top of the hour, so let me just give you kind of a heads up about what we'll continue our discussion on for Thursday. Obviously, we have lots of other little word pairs around here. So how loud someone's breathing versus quietly, does that map on the change grid? Is their breathing nice and smooth, or is it labored? Is their breathing rate or breathing pattern very steady, or does the breathing pattern change sporadically? Are things very regular in the frequency of breathing, etc., or is it variable as well? Is the breathing very active or passive? Usually for people, inspiration is very active, but for the most part, expiration is very passive. But there are times when we will all expire our air in a very active way. If you really wanted to empty your lungs, you'd have to engage some muscles to do that. But generally, relaxed breathing, or I think they call it eupnea. Is that what's called? E-U-P-N-E-A? Is that kind of normal sort of breathing? Inspiration is active, expiration is passive. Where are there pauses in breathing? Is your breathing a 2-stroke process, a 3-stroke process, or a 4-stroke process? We'll also be talking about is the amount of time that you spend in each of these phases of the breath equal, or do they change in different number? What's going on as far as for how many counts am I breathing in? How many counts am I holding my breath with my lungs full? How long to expire? How long do I pause before I begin my next breath? Is that all very even? Is it all very variable? What's going on there? And then again, I was also talking about placement. So is it up in the chest? Is it down in the abdomen? And at some point, I do want to get into some unique things that happen in breathing. And a lot of these are actually forms of communication with others. So sighing, gasping, yawning. We talked about puff and blow. We talked a little bit about hyperventilating. So we'd like to take a look at all these things just so we get our general sense. And then what I'd like to do is say, now let's look at the adjective map. Let's look at the emotions that are falling in each of these areas where we now have these characteristics and see if that gives a strong connection to that emotion. So if I go and I can describe the breathing of anger. I can describe the breathing of sadness. I can describe the breathing of joy. I can describe the breathing of confidence. We can then put together breathing patterns that can be used to help people move themselves into any state, from any state they happen to be into any state they'd like to be in. Obviously, they've got to be in some deliberate, conscious kind of mode to even care about that. But would it be great if we could say, hey, there's another element in our tool set for how we can help move someone around? Okay, questions, comments? Nope. All right then. Thanks all very much for joining in. We'll continue our conversation on Thursday. Bye for now, everyone.
Bye.